So tonight we are pleased to welcome Bill Deen back to Mass Bay RE with tonight's program, La Trochita, Patagonian Steam in 2023. In far southwest Argentina is a 250-mile all-steam, 2.5-foot gauge railroad still using its original equipment. Made famous internationally by Paul Theroux's 1979 book, The Old Patagonian Express, it is often called that. Locally, it's known affectionately as La Trochita, literally the small gauge. To commemorate the centennial of the start of its construction, Trains and Travel International ran a charter in November 2023 that sought to traverse the railroad in its entirety. Mikados, built in 1922 by Baldwin or Henschel, pulled wooden coaches of the same vintage. Those on the tour enjoyed several days with spectacular steam action with snow-capped mountains as backdrops. That all ended abruptly when the entire train derailed and tipped over at a remote location. Our speaker tonight, Bill Deen, is a retired chemical engineering professor who for many years has photographed steam in the United States, Canada, and occasionally overseas. He's the president of the Friends of Bedford Depot Park, a rail preservation group based in Bedford, Massachusetts. His book detailing the history of Boston and Maine's Lexington branch, Minuteman Railroad, was published last year. He's also a model railroader focusing on steam era Pacific logging in HO scale. So, Bill, welcome back to Mass Bay RE, and let's go to Argentina.
Well, thank you, Dave, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. I'll be talking about my adventure in Argentina from November of last year. And before I get into that, I do have a lot of photos to share with you. I'm going to do a bit of orientation so you'll understand where we were and why. Patagonia is the southern part of Argentina, corresponds to the modern provinces of Rio Negro, Chubut, Santa Cruz, and sometimes Tierra del Fuego is included. The middle of the area, maybe the middle of Chubut province, is about 1,000 miles southwest of the capital of Buenos Aires. I'll be mentioning two small cities in sort of the north end of Patagonia, Bariloche in the Andes foothills and Viedma near the Atlantic Ocean. One of the train rides on our itinerary was an overnight trip on a broad gauge line that crosses Patagonia from the Andes to the ocean between those two spots. But our focus mainly was in the northwest part of Patagonia in Rio Negro and Chubut provinces. And this focuses on where we were for most of the time. The Tren Patagonico is the operating company of the broad gauge that runs all the way across the region from Bariloche to Viedma. And what the map shows here is the first quarter of it between Bariloche and Jacobazzi. But our main reason for being there was the narrow gauge, called informally La Trochita. The terms of the names, during its prime, it was simply the Esquel branch. Esquel was the southern terminal here. The Esquel branch of the national railway system, Ferrocarriles Argentinos. But after Paul Theroux's book was published, which was entitled The Old Patagonian Express, and that was the name of his last chapter that he spent, talked about the time he spent on the narrow gauge, people started calling it the Old Patagonian Express. But it's always been to the local people who've used it, La Trochita, which is kind of an affectionate term that just means, translates to the small gauge or the little gauge. Now, the narrow gauge from Jacobazzi to Esquel runs 250 miles. To compare that with something more familiar, that's almost exactly the same distance as Alamosa to Silverton, Colorado. It's another similarity is that during its last decades of regular through service, in both cases, that in the Rio Grande, The railroad was powered exclusively by about 20 Mikado type locomotives. One difference is that whereas the 100 miles in the middle of the Rio Grande San Juan extension from Chama to Durango was torn up in the early 70s, the entire 250-mile main line of the La Trochita is still intact. Only parts of it see regular operation, though, and it's divided into three operationally separate segments that actually don't share equipment. One runs from Jacobasi to Ojos de Agua. The map here is indicating that this is dual gauge, the first 10 miles out of Jacobasi. So the trains there are headquartered in Jacobasi. The middle section is headquartered in El Maiten, which is traditionally is the major shop town on the railroad, and runs only down to south of there to a place called Tome. And then the southern part runs between Esquel, where it's headquartered, and a little place called Nahuel Pan. So only some 55 miles of the narrow gauge sees regular operation, although the entire main line is intact, more or less. But our objective of our tour was to try to ride the whole thing. We didn't quite make it. We did ride, though, close to 200 miles, and of course, including a lot of mileage that one doesn't normally see. Okay, so my story will start with a Sunday in which we rode on the broad gauge from Bariloche to Jacobasi, and then we'll pick up from there on the 6 days that we spent on the narrow gauge between there and Esquel. Bariloche is a very pretty area. The setting has been compared to the Swiss Alps. There's a big lake, snow-capped mountains in the distance. Very popular ski area and area for other outdoor sports. The train that the Tren Patagonico, the equipment that they provided for our charter, was this 2-car Fiat motor train. And so we spent the first day, which was a Sunday, riding that between Bariloche and Jacobasi. Soon after climbing out of the valley where Bariloche is located with the lake, the land becomes very arid. Trees become more stunted, eventually essentially disappear. It's a very arid, rocky kind of landscape. There are a couple of major river crossings. This is one of them. We had plenty of time that day for lots of run-bys. Here it's even drier, farther east. A lot of evidence of ancient volcanic activity. The photo on the lower right at first glance looks like a yellow-green stream, but it's really yellow-green bushes that have managed to gain a foothold in an arroyo that occasionally has some water in it. So very tough vegetation to survive in this particular kind of landscape. Throughout Patagonia, including, of course, also on the narrow gauge, one sees buildings like the one that's to the left of the train. It's a section house. It was built entirely out of discarded cross ties. Wood is very valuable and scarce, expensive in Patagonia, and any kind of a usable timber was just not thrown away. And so all over one sees section houses, or even the residences that are behind it, you can just barely see, are also built out of discarded cross ties. On our charter, we were able to come up and ride in the cab whenever we wanted. And this is a look at the right-of-way. Looks more like in a semi-abandoned branch in Utah or Nevada than it does a 500-mile main line across the entire region. But that was its condition when we were there. We're now getting near Jacobazzi, and we've just reached the point where the dual gauge out of Jacobazzi comes to an end. In the left picture, right in the middle in the distance, you can see the junction points guarded by that semaphore. On the right, the switch ahead of the engine is the junction switch, and that track that looks like it's heading off into the weeds is actually heading off 250 miles of narrow gauge to Esquel. This is a place called Empalme. We'll be back there in a little bit. In the distance, you can see dozens of narrow gauge stock and box cars. The ones up in this area were basically in derelict condition, and the local people have taken some of the salvaged some of the wood. The narrow gauge has not had regular freight service for more than 30 years, and so these cars really had no future. But there are some in better condition that are stored elsewhere. Here's some examples of the rolling stock. Although Paul Thoreau called it the old Patagonian Express, it's really not that old. Construction was started in 1922, and it did not reach a scale until 1945. All the freight equipment is steel underframe. You won't find a truss rod. Some of it is as shown here, is in much better shape than the equipment that's stored at Empalme. The stock cars were interesting, like the one here on the upper right. They had end doors rather than side doors. Stock cars and box cars were plentiful. The main freight hauled by the railroad in its day was wool and sheep. The lower right is an example of one of the crew cars that were had sliding side doors. Well, we've reached now Jacobazzi, 121 miles, quarter of the way across Patagonia from Bariloche. There is, you can see the dual gauge on the left. This is the broad gauge station on the left, the narrow gauge station on the right. They're about 100 yards apart. I just turned around and basically took a picture to the east and then one to the west. So it's getting late in the day. It's kind of cloudy, but we still had some time to walk around the yards. On the left here, this is the narrow gauge section. There's a broad gauge yard and a narrow gauge yard in Jacobazzi, and corresponding shop buildings. We're looking on the left across the narrow gauge steel girder, but still Armstrong turntable. In other words, hand operated turntable. In the distance, you see the 3-stall narrow gauge car and locomotive shop, and in the left far distance, the big buildings are the broad gauge facilities. We had free run of the shops, and so I walked in this door that showed one of the mics. Looked like I was getting a drink from a hose there, and inside were 2 Mikados being prepped for the next day. All of the locomotives in the lines, I said, are 282s or Mikados. They were all built in 1922. The lower numbered ones, originally 1 through 25, were built by Baldwin, and the ones in the 100 series are built by Henschel of Germany. Let me go back a couple of slides here and point out that as you can see here in the freight cars, all the equipment was equipped with knuckle couplers, no buffers, so it had quite a North American look in general. These are the 2 locomotives that would be on our first leg of the charter the next day. So now it's Monday morning, and by the time I got there after breakfast, the 104 had already made up the train. There was you see on the right photo in the distance, it has a water car ahead of it, and the 19 has just come out of the shop. It's going to go to the turntable, be turned, and then back down onto the front of the train to get us going toward Empalme. Here is Empalme, the end of the dual gauge. On the left photo, just in front of the set of pickup trucks, as you can see a track there, that is actually the broad gauge track heading toward Bariloche, and our train has just entered the narrow gauge from the dual gauge, and that's the Empalme depot, behind it. Looking at the uniformed brakeman on the back here gives me a reminder to comment that I thought all the railroad personnel were very professional and expert at their jobs, and I think his uniform sort of communicates that. Our first water stop, we're now up to I started the mileage at Jacobasi, so we're up to milepost 27. Place called Ojos de Agua, and this was a chance to use an operating standpipe to fill both tenders and the water car that both engines are using, which took some time and required a couple moves of the equipment to line it up with the pipe. Ojos de Agua is one of a bunch of villages along the line that have maybe 100 or 200 population. That's pretty much it, I think, behind the train there. Very sparsely populated area served by the narrow gauge. Well, this is my first chance to jump on board and get a nice cab ride on one of the Baldwins. Here, you see the fire. This is before we left. The fireman is adjusting something. I'm not sure what. On the right, the engineer, Nelson Sepulveda, is standing all the way. This is about an hour and a half cab ride. He's got his left hand resting on the throttle quadrant, and he's probably thinking about pulling that red lever that you see in the above the front cab window, which is connected to a rod which opens the sander valves. And on this particular segment, we're going over one of the 4,000 or so foot summits on the railroad. So there was definitely a need for sand. Next water stop was at another little place. I don't know if the population is even 100. Different strategy was required here. A fire truck came out 50 miles on dirt roads from Jacobasi to pump water into the tenders. Next water stop was at in the village of Rio Chico. The station name there is Cerro Mesa, I think, to probably avoid confusion with the actual river, which is shown here on the left. This is one of the major rivers in Patagonia. Those tall, thin trees, by the way, are poplars that were imported many years ago from Italy to serve as windbreaks, and you see them from time to time around the ranches in Patagonia. Cerro Mesa Depot on the top right, and another one of those railroad tie section house buildings on the bottom right. Well, Rio Chico or Cerro Mesa was just a mile north, railroad north of one of the main engineering features on the railroad, which is this 300+ foot truss bridge over the Rio Chico. When it was built in the early 1930s, it was said to have been the longest such steel truss in South America. I don't know if that's still the case. And here's the Henschel 104 doing the honors on some run-bys. I read somewhere that there was extra side and top clearances built into the bridge in case the narrow gauge was ever converted to broad gauge, but of course that never happened. Now, about 100 yards after the bridge was the one tunnel on the line going through the formation called Cerro Mesa. And here's again the 104 doing the honors. This was as far as we got that first day, milepost 82. Our original objective was to try to get to milepost 124, a place called Narquinco. We're prevented from doing that because of a very unfortunate geological occurrence. The previous year, there had been a major washout at milepost 90. That's 7-8 miles beyond where we got on that first day. And here's the original damage and a shot of the repairs in progress. And then it was fully restored before our trip, but then a week before our charter started, there were torrential rains and snow, and it softened the dirt fill enough it was judged to be not safe enough to for passage. And so our first day ended at the Rio Chico. So the second day of the narrow gauge was a Tuesday. So we're now in the central operating segment, and starting at this Narquinco. All the locomotives were supposed to be lettered authentically Ferrocarriles Argentinas for our charter. The number 4 here didn't get the memo though. It has the tourist lettering where it says in Spanish, Old Patagonian Express, La Trochita, and then Chubut is the province, Chubut, Argentina. The coaches all had 2-1 seating like this. This is a first class coach. The first class coaches had padded seat backs and seats. The second class ones just had plain wood seating. All were equipped with wood stoves in the center of the car for heating, which when we went was November, which is spring in Argentina, and the temperatures were very mild. It was in the 60s probably most days, and we certainly really had little need for the heat, but certainly sometimes of the year that's pretty important there. Whole hillsides are covered by plants like the ones on the right. I don't know what the name of that is, but there are 2 or 3 kinds of very hardy bushes that covered much of the arid landscape. Now we've reached El Maiten. We've come about 20 some miles south. Here's the train on the another major river bridge. It's the Rio Chubut on the outskirts of El Maiten. El Maiten's significance was that it was the major shop town on the narrow gauge, and it was the La Trochita's Altoona, or if you're an SP fan, it would be Sacramento, or a B&M fan, it would be North Billerica. It was where all the heaviest locomotive and car repairs were done, and much of the shop complex is still there, although a lot of it is underused now as the railroad activity has declined a great deal. Here's some of the some shots around the shop complex. The 101 there in the top right was, I think, a standby engine for the middle segment. The 16 is tenderless, at least then, but I think intact. It looked like there were basically 2 operable locomotives in each of the 3 segments, and then a third that was could be made operable. So that's a total of 9, and there were said to have been 20 some mics at the end of regular service, and you'll see parts of some of the rest of them in a minute. Main shop building on the top left, the signs were not for the employees. It was just there for telling visitors what the various bays were for. So they were just part of the tourist trains out of LMI-10. People were obviously allowed to walk through the shop area. Around and in back of the shop, there was an extensive deadline and boilers and pieces of locomotives and running gear, and so I guess this is where the rest of the 20-some Mikados have ended up. As I said, 6, I believe, are serviceable. Probably another 3 could be made serviceable, and the rest are being, I think, cannibalized for parts. This is south of LMI-10. You notice that something has happened to the lettering on the tender, the number 4. Our tour operator, Chris Scow, has hired one of the railroad employees to go to a hardware store and buy some black paint and paint out the tourist lettering on the tender. We've reached now the end of the south end of operations on the middle segment, this place called Tome. And this is a service from here 16 miles south is been blockaded by the Mapuche Indian tribe. It goes through land that the government has in recent years granted to the Indians, and they have protesting over their treatment over the years. They have prevented any train traffic from crossing their land, and so we had to terminate there. That's also where the middle segment tourist trains turn. There was a Y and a siding, and these are a couple shots of the switching of the to reverse the order of all the cars and also turn the engine on the Y. The Y is off to the right there on the top left photo. So that was the end of Tuesday, second day on the narrow gauge. And then on Wednesday, we picked up again at the village of Leleque. And we're going to try to get all the way to the south end at Esquel. Stopped a few miles short of that, and but it was still one of the better days that we had that week. On the right there, another railroad tie building. This one has some whitewash to make it a little spiffier. That and the photo on the right show, like, again, more or less all there was to the lake. Here we had another Baldwin for the day. Working our way south. And now, since the railroad goes going south, it's actually going southwest. We're getting closer and closer to the mountains, and so you can start to see the snow-capped Andes in the background of some of the shots. This second car in the consist acted as a supply car for a concession that was operating out of the scale. And I don't know what the cupola-like thing is on the roof. And anyway, it looks like it might have been an outfit car or something that's been adapted for the food and beverage concession. Lepa is yet another one of the little, sort of village, stations. There might be a couple of ranches in the vicinity. Water tank, standpipe, just not shown here, but undoubtedly there was a Y and then a couple of sidings, and that was what one sees all the way along the railroad facilities of that character. As we go farther south, more ingenuity is required of this train crew to get water. Here they take along with them a gas-powered pump and some hose, and then here they're pumping water out of a trackside irrigation canal to replenish the tender. This gave me another chance to hop on the cab. In this case, it was another one of the Baldwins. The engineer here is in a classic position. If you look at the throttle position, he's got the throttle wide open, and he's adjusting the speed using by notching up or down on the Johnson bar. As I said, I thought all the engine and train crew were very professional and I think very dedicated to their work. Some of them are second or even third generation narrow gauge railroad men. There are a couple of these deck lattice trusses on the railroad, and I think the size of those abutments speaks to the occasional violent floods that the area suffers. When the railroad was started in 1922, it was from the north end. Several miles were built, and the location was miscalculated, and they had to rebuild much of it on higher ground and with better drainage. And then, when construction resumed in the 1930s, it wasn't until the 1945 that actually the track reached a scale. So although Thoreau called it the old Patagonian Express, it's not that old, and certainly the train speeds never merited the word express, but so yeah. Little train, big country. Here we're reaching the end of our Wednesday trip. We didn't make it all the way to Esquel that day. It was getting late. And so we went back to our hotel. I should mention maybe that during our 6 days in the narrow gauge, we had 5 nights in the area, and Chris Scow, the tour operator, had arranged for us to stay in the same hotel each of the 5 nights, which had a lot of merit to it. Actually, a very nice place in a town called El Bolson. I won't go back to the map. But what that required was that we be bused every morning from the hotel to where we would start that day's train ride, and then bus back there in the evening. And the bus rides were, depending on where we were 1 to 3 hours. By the way, a lot of the roads, most of the roads actually in the area were dirt. There were very few paved roads. And so it made for some very long days. We might have 10 or even 12 hours on the railroad, and then another 2 or 3 hours on on bus rides. So it was a tiring trip, although I'm very glad I went. Now we're up to Thursday, so our 4th day on the narrow gauge, and we're going to start working our way back north. This is the southern terminus at Esquel, milepost 250. You can see from the left, especially, Esquel is in a beautiful setting surrounded by mountains. It's has a population of maybe 30,000 and fairly prosperous area, unlike the north end at Jacobasi, which is kind of a dying town. Esquel has it's about 20 or 30 miles from a national park, and it has a university, and I think is one of the main commercial centers of that part of Patagonia. So reflecting that, there's a brand new depot in Esquel. You can see on the top right, there's a train mosaic that's been created on one end. And it's probably the Esquel to Naquil Pond tourist segment that has the best prospects for surviving into the future. We didn't get to Esquel that morning in time for to tour the shop buildings. I don't know what they had there in terms of extra equipment. We did have the Baldwin #1 took us south, and then the Henschel 114 is going to take us north on that segment. Here it is, assembling the train while we're waiting there in the morning. The Henschels have some European features, the oval, windows, especially the crank opening on the smoke box front. But said before, knuckle couplers. All the locomotives, by the way, are and always were oil burners. And it looks like most of the tenders have had a second oil bunker added onto the first to increase the capacity. Here we're climbing out of Esquel. Like parts of Colorado, you could kind of point your camera in any direction and get a pretty good scenery shot. In the valley below where the track is, there's some especially fertile ranch and farmland. Esquel, I think, was the terminus. It was the major objective when the railroad was constructed, and well, I think a lot of the wool and sheep came out of ranches in or near Esquel when the railroad was hauling freight. We've come 12 miles now, railroad north out of Esquel to Naquil Pan, which is basically a road crossing, but it was a convenient spot to terminate the tourist trains. There's a Y there. Out of the picture to the right, there's a brand new sort of kind of visitor center, kind of building for people riding the tourist train. So very, very good infrastructure there. And the left is an example of one of the ranches in the area. This is kind of a little engine that could sequence. It thinks it can, still thinks it can, and it could. Again, climbing out of railroad north out of Naquil Pan with the Henschel 114. More ingenuity was needed. Again, for a water stop here, there was a stream crossing, and the crew got out the trusty gas-powered pump and hose and filled the tender that way. We've been to Ilmaiten before. I had mentioned already that it was originally the main shop town on the railroad. We're now going north. I think I neglected to mention earlier the main difference between the Baldwins and the Henschels is the Baldwins are all outside frame, like the Rio Grande Mikados. The Henschels are all inside frame. You probably noticed that already if it's something that you care about. So we're going to go, we skipped Tomé this time on the northbound segment. We're just going to go from Ilmaiten up to Narquinco. Here's the crossing of the Rio Chubut again, this time with the sun out, unlike a couple of days before. See the engineer looking over down toward the right of way. This is an area where they started to have, as I recall, issues with the sander's not working and the driver's slipping. And I don't have a photo of it, but at one point there were a couple of guys walking ahead of the engine, which was going at a walking pace, spreading sand or dirt on the rails by hand. And I think there was a segment where they were a couple of guys were riding the pilot beam, doing the same thing. So the sanders on the locomotive seemed to be being a consistent problem. There's a ranch in the left distance. You can see the poplars planted as windbreaks. Right in the middle of the photo is a sign that says Massa. He was the losing presidential candidate. The election for Argentine president occurred the Sunday after this picture was taken. So this is fair on the area on the right. This is fairly nice ranch land. It's flat. There's a lot of grass. There's not so much of those bushes, and so probably it's pretty good sheep or cattle grazing land. But again, you can see how arid the area is from the distant hillside. Well, we've gone 3 days railroad south on the narrow gauge, and we've gone 2 days railroad north. The day I just showed you, we reached Norquinco. And now it's Saturday, day 6 on the narrow gauge, and it's going to begin at Rio Chico or Cerro Mesa Station. And what we needed to do that day was to get from there all the way back to Jacobazzi to complete the round trip. But there was a choice, and Chris Scow put it up to a vote. Should we go directly from Rio Chico to Jacobazzi, which was going to be a long day in itself, and I voted for that? Or should we go railroad south a few ways, where you see the arrow with the question mark, so to try to cover the most mileage possible, to go all the way to the washout or the washout site at milepost 90. Remember, Rio Chico was milepost 82. Well, the mileage collectors won. The vote was about 2-1, and so we boarded at Rio Chico or Cerro Mesa Station, headed through the big truss bridge again, through the tunnel again, and headed railroad south from there to try to get to where the big washout had been the year before. Well, we only got 2 miles beyond the tunnel, and this is what happened. There was, by my eye, it must have been a soft spot in the roadbed, probably created by the torrential rains the week before that I had already mentioned. This was one of the seldom used segments of the railroad, and without the best maintenance, I'm sure. And so the Henschel 104 went over on its side like this. When it went over, all 5 cars did also. The cars were all connected to one another by pairs of safety chains, which is a good idea if you want to prevent break-in-twos, and probably a good idea also if a single car derails. It'll help keep it on the roadbed. But what happened in this case is it helped created sort of a domino effect. When the engine went over, all the cars went over on their sides as well. It was for most, it was a pretty frightening experience. There was a range of injuries. There was 4 people, I believe, were hospitalized, 3 briefly, but 1 for 2 months. Finally, he was able to go back to the UK in January after, I think, going first to Bariloche, and then I think he had to go to Buenos Aires for, I'm thinking it was neck surgery. But anyway, he was in bad shape for a while, but there were no fatalities. The engine crew, I think the fireman, I think, escaped just with some bruises. The engineer had some cuts and burns, but they were reported to be back at work in December. Picture at the left is not too long after the rollover. You'll notice that the photo credits here, go back here, they're no longer me. Now, where am I? Well, when I was riding in the 3rd car there, the coach that is broken apart, and apparently as soon as the train started to tip, I hit my head and I was unconscious. And I have no memory of the train tipping over, and no memory of, for probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes. When I came to, I was sitting in one of the chairs that you see on the left. Those chairs had been taken out of the dining car, which is the second to last car. They'd been gotten out of one of the doors and set up for people that were shaken up. And so I basically missed the wreck, but I was told about it, and because I had been unconscious, I was one of the first group evacuated on the dirt roads from the railroad personnel coming in pickup trucks and other small vehicles, and first responders from the little village of Rio Chico coming out. And they took us to a clinic in town and did the triage as best they could, very professional. And for me, they asked me what day it was, looked at my eyes, see if my pupils were dilated, gave me an ice pack for the big bump that was forming on my forehead, and the 2 black eyes that were beginning to develop, and then had me sit in the next room for a while, and then asked me later if I wanted more treatment. I decided that for a concussion, the best thing to do is just wait and take it easy, and so I declined an opportunity that was presented to go to a larger place. But I thought that both the train crew and the first responders from the little village did magnificently. You can see how badly broken up that 3rd car is where I was riding. The guy in the foreground on the right is my friend, a guy named Chuck Taylor from Richmond, Virginia, who I actually first met on a steam charter in South Africa a few years ago. So anyway, he ended up being on this. He and I were both in that car that's broken apart that you see in the back. He was 2 rows in front of the wood stove. I was 2 rows behind. As I said, I hit my head. I don't know what happened. I know I was told that one of the train crew pulled me out of the car. A fire started in the car, a small fire. It was quickly extinguished. But what Chuck is holding up is his backpack, which was singed by the fire. But fortunately, although it was inside the pack, his passport was okay. I'm nowhere in these pictures. Actually don't even know what my state was when these pictures were taken. Although just to the left of Chuck near his feet, that's my backpack. So I must have been somewhere in the vicinity. This is very late in the evacuation, gives you another kind of sense of how remote the area was. Most people by now have been evacuated. There are just a few people in the best shape, least needing attention, that are still milling around, and you still see the chairs there from the that had been taken out of the dining car. The last I heard was that the equipment is still there on its side. There's a formal investigation of the accident is possibly still ongoing, or maybe it's done by now. And I don't know what the plans are or what the capabilities are for recovering the equipment. And tourist train on the north end. This is, of course, north end equipment. Has been suspended for the current season. Remember, it's now summer in Argentina. By the way, service on the broad gauge, the Tren Patagonico, from Bariloche over to Viedma has also been suspended indefinitely because of the track conditions. So whether that will ever be resumed, I don't know. Whether what will happen with the narrow gauge, at least the north end of the narrow gauge, is unknown to me, at least now too. So this means in part that mileage collecting can be hazardous to one's health. It also means, though, be careful with the train, which is what these grade crossing signs mean in Spanish. Well, that was not the end of the tour. Most of us, although banged up, as I said, I had a swollen forehead, eye half closed, 2 black eyes, and was feeling kind of woozy. But the most practical thing to do to get back to our origin of Buenos Aires was to stick with the itinerary, the train and charter bus itinerary that was going to get us back there over a period of a couple of days. And so I did that, as did most others, even some with one particular guy with a broken wrist stayed with the tour. So on Sunday was the, or I guess, so Sunday we spent part of the day in Jacobazzi. We were bused then to Bariloche. We caught the overnight broad gauge train from Bariloche to Viedma. And this is now Monday morning. Here's the train. The locomotive was a 2,500 horsepower EMD export model road switcher, CC. And these the auto racks are part of the regular service on the train. You could, for about $50, you could have your car transported all the way across Patagonia. This is a place called San Antonio Oeste, which is when the track first reaches the Atlantic Ocean. It's a few miles west of the terminus at Viedma. Example, the passenger equipment looks a lot like what you might have seen in North America in the 50s or 60s. After a couple charter bus segments and another afternoon evening train ride from the coastal resort of Mar del Plata, we arrived back on Tuesday evening in Buenos Aires. There are 4 major train stations in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is actually served by railroads of 3 different gauges. Plus, it has a very extensive and well patronized subway system, which I did not have a chance to explore. And here we are arriving that Tuesday evening back at the probably the grandest of the stations, the Plaza Constitución. Couple street scenes from Buenos Aires just to prove that I was there, although I didn't have a lot of time and was still not feeling at my best from my concussion, though I gradually came out of it. My camera was damaged, and I thought it was unusable, but it turned out not to be the case. And so I'm back to taking pictures again. Well, that was Tuesday evening. Wednesday and Thursday was the end of the tour, and those 2 days we had relaxing days looking at local rail preservation activities. We were hosted both days by something called the Ferro Club Argentino, a private club with 2 separate museum facilities and equipment collections. On the Wednesday at a place called Escalada, which was I think a former system shop for all the Argentinian broad gauge equipment. That brick building in the background had a plaque that said 1895, and so they had the club was able to get possession of part of the system shop area for their collection. So they nicely fired up this broad gauge Pacific, which of course is enormous compared to anything we saw in the narrow gauge. Looked pretty spiffy. They had a couple hundred yards of a track within the facility, and they ran it back and forth in our honor. Another impressive restoration. I'm just barely touching on their collection. There was a lot of stuff in their collection, a lot of interesting things, but I don't want this to run too much longer. Also at Escalada, they had a restored Baldwin shark A unit. This is a broad gauge, 5'6" shark, operable. They ran it back and forth for us with its original prime mover from 1954. And really very carefully restored. That afternoon, after a nice barbecue lunch that the club provided, we had a couple of hours at a transit museum in Buenos Aires. And the Buenos Aires street railway system was dismantled entirely in the early 1960s, and all of the equipment scrapped. But what the transit enthusiasts have done is gone around the world and found suitable replacements, and to create a trolley museum. The 652 and 258 on the left here are actually both from Oporto, Portugal, and the 652 especially has been cosmetically altered to make it closely resemble a Buenos Aires car. And we were able to get a ride for about a mile on that because due to something quirky about how access to the subway needs to be provided, 1 mile of street trackage was preserved, and the club has been able to erect catenary over that and operate on it. And so this is a regular museum operation. You can see they had possession of these big original car barns from the street railway system also. So they've got a good space for their collection. And again, as with the Ferro Club, some very careful restorations. So the last day was our of our tour was the Thursday. Again, we're in suburban Buenos Aires. This is another Ferro Club location, a place called Lynch. And here they fired up for us an 1890 vintage wood burning 060. You can see the fuel consists of discarded wood pallets. So that was fun to see. Again, I'll just touch on a couple of highlights of their pretty large collection. I especially like this, as Dave mentioned that I'm interested in logging railroads, especially Western logging railroads, and spent a lot of time learning about them. And I can say with some confidence that only one logging railroad of the hundreds or even thousands that once existed in North America ever used electric locomotives. It was the Red River Lumber Company out of Westwood, California. And top left here is a picture of them in regular service, double heading on a log train. Well, when the Red River was finished with them, they sold them to the Pacific Electric in the late 40s, and then Pacific Electric in the early 50s sold them to Argentina. And here they are in Buenos Aires, both surviving. That is 100% of electric logging locomotives still survive, and both being very well cared for. The ex-Red River 204 has been repainted in its Pacific Electric livery. Now, if you're a traction fan, maybe you caught the Iowa Traction program a couple months ago. You might wonder, why are they different? Actually, they were both originally were steeple cabs like the Pacific Electric 1592 on the lower right, but they usually operated together, but they one time in the early 30s when they were operating separately, Each was on its own log train, and they had a head-on collision, which ruined the cab of Red River 203. It was rebuilt as a box cab, and it retains that configuration today. So even the photo at the top left, that's actually post collision. You can see the two originally identical steeple cabs are now look different. Another peculiarity there, by the way, is the catenary was set up to for the wires to run along the side rather than the center of the track. So very, very peculiar. Anyway, so that's some of the, I would call the rarest of the rare. And I'll close here with one more slide. And this is La Trochita again at the Lake and with the Andes. And close with the hope that the railroad, which has suffered some hard times over the decades, can once again bounce back from the wreck that our group experienced, and continue to operate well into the future. So I thank you again for tuning in, and I'll be happy to hang around if there are any questions.
Bill, thank you very much. Wonderful program, spectacular scenery, and just some remarkable photographs of the unfortunate wreck that ended that portion of the trip for you. At this point, we don't have any open questions in the Q&A. There's one question about why were there bars on the diesel locomotive. This was right near the end of the show, and I didn't frankly see any bars there. But so for the moment, go ahead.
I would say there were bars, and for the same reason there are bars on locomotives on the T. It's vandalism.
Okay, thanks. So there are no open questions in the Q&A. So at this point, I think, again, Bill, thank you for a wonderful program. There are a number of comments in the webinar chat thanking you for it. I particularly want to thank Todd Minsk, who posted in the chat some information that all the mileage in Argentina is measured in kilometers rather than in miles. And he has posted the metric kilo posts, I guess, for the various stations, and also points out that the gauge is actually 750 millimeters, which is 29.5 inches. So us folks who live by the feet and inches, 30 inches is pretty close, but not quite there. Shades of the green line. Anyway, thanks to everybody. We had a little over 70 people, actually up to 80 on the thing. And at this point, I'm going to end the recording. And one question before we do. When did regular operation end?
I don't have an exact date, but it would have been in the early 90s when the federal government in Argentina was considering abandoning the whole thing. And what they chose to do instead was to transfer it to the two provinces, Rio Negro and Chubut, and let them do what they could with it. So that's about the time that the through service ended.
Yeah, there's pretty good history in Wikipedia, so encourage folks to look that up. So anyway, thanks again. I'm going to stop the recording.